announcement that Mincha at the Bayit is downstairs in the lower Beit Midrash. It's going to be at 8:10 this evening. Ma'ariv will be in this room. We'll daven Ma'ariv immediately following this event. So just for people who are trying to figure out what to do for Minyanim. Welcome. Welcome to everyone who's come. On behalf of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, on behalf of the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, and on behalf of our hosts, the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, welcome to this last dialogue in our series on Modern Orthodoxy. It's just wonderful to have people from the Bayit here. It's wonderful to be working in collaboration, both Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and the Center for Torah Leadership. I'm Rabbi Chagai Reznikov, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah alumnus 2014, and Center for Torah Leadership, Modern Torah Leadership summer program alumnus from 2004. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to actually sit with two of my great teachers and to hear what they have to say on the topic. The topic is electricity and texting on Shabbat, and we'll hear more about that in the continuation. Let me introduce the panelists. Rabbi Linzer is the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School and the primary architect of its groundbreaking curriculum of Torah, Halacha, pastoral counseling, and professional training. He teaches regular classes in advanced Talmud, advanced Halacha, and the thought of modern Orthodoxy, and serves as a religious guide to the yeshiva's 47 rabbinical students and its close to 100 rabbis currently serving in the field. Rabbi Linzer has been a leading rabbinic voice in the modern Orthodox community for over 20 years. and
Well
teaches,
preserved, really well preserved.
the modern Orthodox community, and teaches a Daf Yomi Shir, which is available on YouTube and iTunes. He was most recently the convener of the 2012 Modern Orthodoxy Mashas. Rabbi Aryeh Klapper is Dean of the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, Rosh Beit Midrash of its Summer Beit Midrash program, and a member of the Boston Beit Din. He previously served as Orthodox Advisor and Associate Director for Education at Harvard Hillel, as Talmud Curriculum Chair at Maimonides High School, and as Instructor of Rabbinics and Medical Ethics at Gann Academy. Rabbi Klapper has published in Tradition, Me'orot, Dinei Yisrael, Beit Yitzchak, and other journals, and has presented at numerous academic and community conferences. He's a popular lecturer who has consulted internationally on issues of Jewish law and whose work is cited regularly by both academic and traditional scholars. In the words of Harvard Hillel Executive Director Dr. Bernard Steinberg, he is provocative and evocative. The program tonight is as follows. We're going to begin with an introduction from both panelists discussing the technical issues in using electricity on Shabbat. From there, we'll move on to the educational and communal repercussions from these issues, and in particular, how these issues can help us formulate a conception of Shabbat in general. Finally, we're going to try to concretize and bring down these issues using two real-life applications, the kosher switch and, of course, texting on Shabbat. In between the last two sections, we'll have time for responses and clarifications in addition to questions from the floor. If I'm careful about time, we should take about an hour to finish. We'll see how that happens. Let's get started. To the panelists, would you explain what are the technical issues involved with electricity on Shabbat? Electricity wasn't around during the foundation of most of our most important halachic texts, so it's got to be recent. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about rabbinic issues? Are we talking about d'oraita, about biblical issues? What exactly is the problem? Is it technical or is it a values issue? Rabbi Klapper, can you start?
Sure.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay. So let's there are different ways to break it down. Let's start this way. You can frame the issue of electricity on Shabbat in at least 4 different categories. There is the generation of electricity. There is the use of electricity for purposes that you could accomplish in perfectly permissible ways. There's the use of electricity for purposes that you could accomplish in perfectly permissible ways that have forbidden byproducts. And there's the use of electricity to accomplish ends that that if you were to accomplish them directly would be forbidden. Okay, those are wholly different categories, and each of them generates their own right, their own halachic treatment. So, for example, the generation of electricity, really there isn't any basis for forbidding, and you all generate electricity of a form when you shake out sweaters that have static on them. The only place where that has really come out halachically that I know of directly is there are people who claim that when you descend in elevators, your body on the counterweight actually generates electricity, and they have tried to claim that that is forbidden. But mostly, I think the generation of electricity is actually probably technically the prohibition is only when you generate fire as a byproduct. Then there's a second thing, which is where you do something you could do right. You could do perfectly well anyway. Like for example, you could shout to your friend across the street, or you could speak into a walkie-talkie, so that your friend can hear you across the street, or a microphone. Right. So that's right. If you weren't using the electricity, you're not doing anything forbidden at all. Right. The question is whether using the electric medium creates a problem. Then there's a third thing where you're using electricity to do that, but there's a possibility that in addition to, for example, projecting your voice across the street, the electricity is also heating up an element of some sort. And the final possibility is, let's say, where you press a button and you end up cooking something. I think all of these need to be treated separately. And then we also need to take on Reznikov's initial statement, which is that obviously none of these things were practically useful. Electricity has been around as long as lightning. But the capacity of human beings to utilize electricity is a much more recent phenomenon. The general take on this is that when there is a new reality and there's an old halacha, right, there is no answer in advance as to what the halacha is. Right, that's when you try and figure out, right, well, halacha is constantly adapting itself to new realities, and we, in some kind of interplay between poskim and can decide that this reality is so distinct from the past that that there's no continuity at all, and so we're in a realm where there is no technical halacha. We could decide that that there's some kind of category. Let's call it boneh. Right, so the Chazon Ish took the position in some tried to argue that completing a circuit in some way is a tolda of construction and is included in the 39 categories that the Mishnah mentions of prohibitions on Shabbat. Now, I don't think the answer I think that could have been true, and the question is whether that's the way we paskin. You could and then there are technical things. My teacher, Rabbi J. David Leich, for example, argues that the Jewish community has obviously decided that halacha, that the use of electricity is technically forbidden. It's impossible to create new rabbinic decrees, therefore it must be a biblical decree. The most reasonable defense of a biblical prohibition is the Chazon Ish, and therefore he rules that we treat the completion of circuits, at least circuits that are connected to that are grounded. My own sense is that we've ended up with this very nebulous in-between position, that we have a minhag the way I usually form, we have a minhag to treat the productive completion of an electric circuit as an isur d'Rabbanan. Right, so that's a very complicated statement, right? It's a minhag to treat it as d'Rabbanan, and it's the productive completion of a circuit. I don't know that that is a long-term sustainable position. We've been sort of muddling through, as Linzer said in one of our previous conversations, for the past 100 years. But I don't know if it's a terrible thing that we're muddling through, because the technology is changing so rapidly that it might be that if we made really firm commitments, we would be stuck in ways that would require us to engage in massive Rube Goldberg contraptions to get out of it.
Like the kosher switch.
If we think the kosher switch is necessary, yes.
So I think that's a great overview. I do want to just sort of question or challenge one particular point, which is even if we can't make new d'Rabbanans, we could fit something into a pre-existing d'Rabbanan category the same way we could fit something into a pre-existing d'Oraita category. So I don't exactly get the argument that why we have to make it a d'Oraita if we're going to decide that it's usher. But to get to the larger point, yeah, I think that I'll start by a story, which is the yeshiva many years ago, or 10 years ago, had the opportunity to learn from some people here know Rachel Yehuda, her father, Tzvi Yehuda, who was a Talmud of the Chazon Ish, And he told us a story that the Chazon Ish was the one who famously came out and argued that this was an Isra Bona. You're building a circuit, you're constructing something, maybe because you're giving life to you turn on a computer, there weren't computers then, whatever. You turn something on and it comes to life. Maybe it's like Tikkun Mana, somehow you're changing the object, the vessel. Anyway, but he primarily argued that it was bonus. So, So Yehuda said, he argued with him. He said, you go through all of the logic of how the category of bona normally, is defined, and it fails. Like, you look at the other counter examples, and this would never be called bonus. So Chazon Ish said back to him, he said, what? You think it's a chiddush to say that it's mutter? No, the chiddush is to figure out how it's aser, which means that we're starting with a sense that we can't allow this on Shabbos. There was an intuitive sense that this would really go against our understanding of Shabbat, at least from the sense of what the nature of the day is. And we have to therefore try to find a halachic category, a halachic language to identify how to say that it's aser. Probably the two that are the biggest contenders right now in the halachic discourse, it's either bona, particularly because there's such the weight of the Chazon Ish. So even though that argument has really been, deconstructed, demolished by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who really in a very lengthy tshuva, and it should be, particularly I should say the tshuva he wrote was about hearing aids on Shabbat. Because one of the issues that's sort of this double-edged sword that we'll be dealing with is, on the one hand, I think it's fair to say that none of us, or probably almost none of us, want to see a Shabbat where we're starting to use our cell phones and our computers, and that we have that intuitive sense that is a real deep problem. On the other hand, we also want to allow electricity when there's a need for people that need hearing aids, people that are disabled, for people that sick, elderly, other types of situations. So in a long tshuva about dealing with this and are showing that it's not a deal right, that he takes apart this argument with Shlomo Zalman. So although there are still many that argue that will follow the Chazon Ish, I think it's fair to say that in the Modern Orthodox community and in many communities, we don't really sort of see that as a viable contender. The other argument, the closest somebody has come to sort of putting it in a D'Rabbanan category, I forget, Rabbi Klapper will remind me who the first Achron to say this was, but there's a prohibition of molid, the Gemara talks about not putting perfume spraying perfume into your garments, so you're creating something new, you're sort of, you're inserting that aroma into your garments, so this is also some type of creating something new. Again, it's pretty tendentious, not tendentious, pretty tenuous, but that is sort of the other argument. And again, if you look at all these arguments, most people will say, I'm not so persuaded. Like if it weren't something that I had started with the assumption that was going to be usser, you would not have persuaded me that it's usser. And I think what therefore has developed is what Rabbi Klapper just said, which is at the one hand, we know that, we feel that it has to be usser. We can't exactly identify how. So the sort of way we operate, we as rabbis who get shilohs, operate with it is we act as if it were D'Rabbanan, which gives us the sort of latitude because, to find Teterim when necessary. And at the same time says that as a rule, we don't do this. So I think the question then becomes, if we can acknowledge that it is tenuous how it's forbidden, then why don't we just say it's permissible, which I'm guessing is the next question.
So you're correct. My understanding based on what you said, Rabbi Klapper, you said it could have been a lot of different things, but it sounded like you yourself are not necessarily convinced that it has yet been locked into any one thing, and particularly because of the change that technology is going through, that may not be advantageous for us to at present lock it in. Rabbi Linzer, you emphasized very strongly the idea that this was a foregone conclusion, that this was going to be usher, and now it's a matter of looking and trying to figure out how that's done. So if we're talking about a values conversation here, where we already know it's usher, and the question is, how do we decide what is going to be the most advantageous category to put it in? What are the values that we're talking about? And how do those values reflect on a general conception of Shabbat? Because at the end of the day, the question is, what do those values that we're talking about have to do with Shabbat itself? And last of all, in many situations, we tend to say that things that are not technical halachic issues, we don't give a lot of weight to in terms of deciding what is mutar and what is asur. in this case, for some reason, we do, or maybe not. Is this a different kind of category? Rabbi Linzer, maybe you'll start.
Okay,
Six
so,
minutes.
all righty. So, let me say one last thing to transition us. You know, Rav Moshe actually wrote a tshuva about not using Shabbos clocks, and which also, by the way, shows it's some things could be perceived of as a violation of Shabbat, and then ultimately the community sort of votes otherwise, and he really was not able to sustain that. But in discussing why he thought Shabbos clocks should be forbidden, he basically says, you know, well, even if I can't, A, it's something that had the rabbis known about, they would have forbidden, and B, maybe I'll try to put it in the category of Amira Lagoy, and C, even if I can't do that, something that should be forbidden, we certainly shouldn't say that it's mutter. So he's also dealing with grappling with that sense, at least his sense was that it would create the sense of violation, and also trying to say, like, where is that halachic language? In the end, what he's left with, and this will transition us to answer Rabbi Reznikov's question, is saying that it's a problem of ziluta de Shabbos, which is like, it's a zilzul, it's a denigration, it's something other terms we might hear about things like this is uvda dechol, it's weekday activity, it violates the spirit of Shabbat, it's not Shabbostic. The problem with that language is that it's all like, okay, so what you're telling me, it's not really usher, right? The problem with that language is that because we think very much as that the only thing that's a real religious obligation are things that you can articulate in technical halachic language, and that sounds way too amorphous. We don't really feel that that's a weighty sort of mandate, that would be a serious problem to violate. Now, the irony here is that more than anything else, this idea of the experience of Shabbat has Joraisa elements to it. Ramban already, famously writes in a number of places that the fact that the Torah says, tishpot and Shabbaton, and not just don't do malacha, means that we have a mandate to protect and to cultivate a certain Shabbos experience and a quality of the day. I'll talk about in a minute what that quality of the day is, or maybe that will get us to the next part. But that is for him, that idea. And the psukim in the Nevi'im, right, which is that Shabbos should be a day from seeking out your pursuit and speaking your normal talks. And the way the rabbis understand that is that you're talking on Shabbat should not be like you talk during the weekday, and you're walking on Shabbat, the way you travel should not be the way you travel. And there are real mandates around creating that experience. We have to fill in the blanks of what is that quality that we're looking to create. But there are real mandates in the Torah and in the Nevi'im about that are not sort of technical drabbanans or technical dioraisas. So I think that the first sort of response is, and this is where that's that intuitive response. Of course, it's got to be usher. It'll violate the whole experience of Shabbat. So how do I articulate that? If you really ask me how I articulate that, I could use language of ziluta or uvda dechol. I'd rather use language of shabbason. So heftzach, I'd rather use language shabbaton because it's like this biblical language. And I want to now actually talk about where that comes up in two places in the Gemara. This idea of using this language. Number one is a Mishnah that perhaps is the earliest articulation of this concept of shavut, and it says that elu chayavim mishum shavut, says a Mishnah in Beitza. The following things you would be chayav. You would actually be like chayav is a language you normally say for a deoraita, for a biblical thing. You would be chayav for violating shavut, for violating this. So often we translate that as a drabanan, but shavut, according to the Ramban, is anchored in this idea of the quality of the day of Shabbat, and uses language of chayav. And what does it talk about? Going up in a tree, riding on an animal, going on a boat, clapping, dancing, and so on. And while the Bavli explains that this has to do with a concern that it will lead to other violations, you go on an animal, you'll break a branch off of a tree, as you're riding, you're clapping, you'll fix a musical instrument. The simple sense of the sources actually is that this is an intrinsic problem. If you look at the Second Temple sort of literature in terms of the other sects that were around at that time, when in the Book of Jubilees, where it talks about what Shabbos violation is, says somebody rides on an animal or climbs a tree or goes on a boat, you stone them. That's what Shabbos violation is. That's biblical doing malacha. So the rabbi said, no, biblical malacha is only the 39 creative acts. But this, what they were saying is, at the experiential level, is a violation of the Shabbos, of the nature of Shabbat, and chayavim mishum shavut. Not because you're going to come to do something else, but this is central, right? So, for example, the classic image of Elisha ben Avuya, the heretic, right? What did he do? He was riding his horse on Shabbat. That was like the public most, way of completely violating the experience of Shabbat, and we can try to unpack why. So I think we have to revive that language of it's not Shabbos day, but it's actually Chayav Mishum Shavut. And the language, I don't like sort of telling people what you're transgressing, but sometimes you need, sometimes you need some of that language to give it the weight that I think it deserves. So the other language that's important, and this is even weightier, but also comes up in the Gemara, is it's Chilul Shabbos. The Gemara uses the phrase Chilul Shabbos for something shocking. The Gemara says that somebody was knocking on a door, and one of the rabbis says, "Who is this that's being Mechalel Shabbos?" Why? Because his idea was Shabbos has to be totally quiet. And if you're making noise, right, that's clapping and the dancing or whatever, if your Shabbos experience is quiet and contemplative, then making noise is being Mechalel Shabbos. Or another rabbi saw some yeshiva students running, and he said the rabbinic students are being Mechalel Shabbos because they were running. That's not what Shabbos is. It's calm, it's quiet, it's restful, and so on. So I think there's a good basis in our, in the Gemara, in our halachic literature, to use these terms that carry real weight, even if we're not saying technically what exact Isser D'Rabbanan you're being over.
Rabbi Klapper.
Okay, that was wonderful.
Respond.
How long do I have?
I'm sure you have an hour to respond to that.
There's a lot there. Let's take Shabbat clocks. So I used to give a shiur called "The Brief History of Timers," which was tracing Shabbat clocks. The Shabbat clock is invented in the 16th century by the Halachot Tanot as a thought experiment. He's trying to figure out why the Gemara says that if Yom Kippur comes out on Friday, then they have to eat the Yom Kippur sacrifice cold because they can't cook it. And he comes up with this cool idea: why don't you create a 24-hour fuse, light it before Shabbat, and the rope will burn all the way. After you shech Yom Kippur korban, you put it in the pot. There's no fire under the pot yet. And 24 hours later, magically, you have roast korban. Right, so he invents the Shabbat clock and has a whole conversation with his students about whether this works or not, or whether the fire is actually considered to be under the pot so long as it is connected to the fuel. In the 19th century, the Chassam Sofer reports that this actually is the way they made coffee Friday night in Frankfurt. And the Chassam Sofer is challenged. How can you make coffee this way? Aren't you violating Shabbat? And he says, if God didn't want melacha to be done on Shabbat, he would have forbidden non-Jews to do melacha. But he lets non-Jews do all the work on Shabbat, so God doesn't care if melacha is done. What he cares about is whether melacha is done by Jews in forbidden ways. Right? And in this case, the Jew isn't doing the melacha, the string is doing the melacha, so what's your problem? And Shabbat clocks develop over time. They get to be more and more things. And really, it's Moshe Feinstein all of a sudden disregards the Chassam Sofer's logic and says, no, actually, there are certain things that can't happen in a Shabbat atmosphere, as opposed to there are certain things that Jews can't do. And I want to use as an illustration that what spirit of Shabbat is, I think, is a highly flexible category. I think that our conceptions of Shabbat are largely created by some kind of agglomeration of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Right? We have some vision of a castle in time joined together with the notion that we're supposed to demonstrate that God is creative and we are not. And those are useful conceptions of Shabbat, but there are lots of psukim that tell us what Shabbat is that we haven't brought into play. We haven't talked about Zecher L'Maaseh Breshit, and we haven't talked about Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, of which only Heschel is Hirsch is one possible interpretation of Zecher L'Maaseh Breshit. If you're a Kabbalist, then you spend Shabbat being Bonei Olamot, right? Because that's what mitzvot do; they build worlds. So I think we have to be very careful before we commit ourselves to any particular vision of what Shabbat is, and assume that our intuitions are compelling. The other thing I want to set out in the probably one that I have left is my dear friend Rabbi Yaakov Nagin wrote the same paper in many different courses, which the first version of the paper, I believe, argued that there is a dispute between Rabbeinu Tam and between the Rabbi Yitzchak Zaken and the Aryeh among the Balei Tosfot as to the nature of the 39 categories of forbidden work on Shabbat. One of them said that these are the 39 categories, and this is what God prohibits, these 39 things. The other one said is that God prohibits this general category of melacha, and whatever is melacha, you're supposed to stick into these 39 categories. right? But again, ready to argue that this is not only a medieval dispute between the Ri and the Aryeh, it's also a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and between the Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, and ultimately it came down to whether you follow chapter 1 of Bereshit or chapter 2. Because there were many papers and many courses in different historical periods in the Brown Revel Graduate School, and if you could write the same paper over and over again, you saved a lot of time. But underlying that, there's really a fundamental notion, right? Whether these categories are intrinsically meaningful, and to the extent that these categories are not the way our life is lived, so we need to move on and talk about spirit of Shabbat as opposed to technicalities, or whether Shabbat, right, there's supposed to be some kind of abstraction called melacha, which exists in every society, and in which case we are failing if we do not adapt these categories to fit our life. The last thing I want to say is we all know we're not Karaites, right? And the way in which we express that we're not Karaites is that we have crockpots and we eat shalom, right? And we light Shabbat candles. And part of that means is, I think, that Shabbat is not supposed to be in the general, right, the mainstream halachic. Shabbat is not supposed to be an ascetic day, and therefore, if we create a reality in which Shabbat is much less comfortable than the rest of the week, that I think is also a violation of the spirit of Shabbat, right? The spirit of Shabbat is not to deprive us of the benefits of technology, and we have to figure out how we can, on the one hand, perhaps, right, honor the intuition that we're not supposed to be doing everything, but at the same time, I think it's an intuition that we are supposed to have lots of stuff. And then I'll just close with the subjective thing that for me, certainly the hardest parts of Shabbat, on the one hand, is I can't write, but that I know is a classical thing, although it was much less problematic in a culture where Torah was really bel peh. But the hardest thing is, right, this is how I learn. And so Shabbat is the day when basically the vast majority of my Torah knowledge just evaporates, right? Because what my Torah knowledge is a series of links. And without the database, right, those links go nowhere. And so that, I think, is something that we have to really consider. It turns out that Shabbat is kind of like I think in the first Star Trek movie, DeForest Kelley, Dr. McCoy, presents William Shatner with a gift. It's a book that you can actually read, right? And that's what Shabbat.
Random access.
Yeah, that's what Shabbat, right? Shabbat is the day when, now for me it is now, right? Shabbat is the day I take out my books. But I don't know that culturally that's what we want to be as a day. Shabbat is the day when when everyone loses all their bikiyas.
So I'd like to just add one further question to this conversation, which is, until now, the two of you have given a really beautiful explanation of what is Shabbat, what does that mean? How much of the conversation that you're having now is a message that is communicated to the Balabatim, to the people who are actually in the communities who have to then follow the Shabbatot that poskim like yourselves decide is the Shabbat, and how much is that conversation open to what they're doing, and how much of it is something that comes to you from sort of the learning and the text that you're engaged with? Rabbi Klapper, maybe you can start.
Okay. So I should say that I have thus far avoided really giving a very strong conception of Shabbat, and that's partially l'shitati, in that I do think that what Shabbat is still being negotiated, and I think we really are muddling through because technology is changing so dramatically that we would be unwise to lock ourselves into. Right there, I think a variety of positions that serious poskim advanced in the 20th century that if we took them today would make life unlivable, and we're still trying to figure out, for example, what life is going to be like when I'm still reeling from a bar mitzvah I was at several months ago, where I was in a hotel. We were on the 4th floor, and I said, "Okay, I'll take the stairs." I walk into the staircase a moment before Shabbat, and the lights brighten at my presence. So there's no way out. Right, and now I'm told that actually is the case in Newton, Massachusetts. That the street, you walk down the street, and the street lights brighten at your presence. Somebody in England sued their co-op because their co-op put motion sensors in the hallways, and they said now they can't leave my apartment all Shabbat. So these are challenges that we really need to face. My take is that in general, halakha is supposed to be a dialogue between poskim and the community, and part of that, and the community's vote is, first of all, by picking which poskim. And secondly, I think the more educated and the more committed the community is, the more its intuition has to be deferred to by the poskim. So Rabbi Linzer mentioned, on Shabbat Klapper, Moshe Feinstein, who was the poskim of the generation, thought and acknowledged that he fought a losing battle. on Shabbat. Right? He wanted to ban Shabbat clocks for everything, but then he realized that he couldn't do it because we allowed him Yerlakum we allowed asking non-Jews to turn on lights, so he couldn't forbid it for lights. And then he realized people weren't going to tolerate it on air conditioning because Shabbat wasn't supposed to be the only day of the week you were hot, right? So he had to allow it for air conditioners, and eventually he also allowed it for dishwashers, right, and all sorts of things because he ran up against the communal intuition that Shabbat was not supposed to be unpleasant. So I think that it's very challenging for a posek, no matter how learned they are right now, to articulate a clear vision of what Shabbat is supposed to be, because when every fifth grader comes and looks at you and says, it doesn't feel to me when I push a button that I am doing work. Right? Every fifth grader says this to you. Perhaps they've watched the Jetsons, where you can see George Jetson doing the thumb exercises before he pushes his button, then he comes home and complains. In, out, in, out. It's like every day, But I think that is a fundamental question: is if our conception of Shabbat was built around Shabbat as a day in which we don't do work, so then physical activity and the accomplishment of physical activity is probably not the way to accomplish that. So we need to, so we have instead, Rabbi Heschel came up with this wholly new category, Palestine time, not Castle time, where technology is sort of seen as oppression. And this is a day in which we can release ourselves from the artificiality of the universe and walk in Central Park, which or Riverside Drive. I think I've told all the nature in Heschel is really just from his walks to Riverside Drive. I like all pastoral poetry is from urban dwellers, because real pastoral people understand that it's hard work. So I think that there is a different vision of technology in which technology is liberating. And as Rabbi Linzer pointed out, this is particularly the case for people who have physical disabilities, for whom from technology, deprive them of technology, and you're locking them into bodies in a way which is oppressive. So, 1 minute, So I think that there is still a great deal of work. I think that there was an intuition which was unquestionably true for about 50 years, that somehow the use of electricity on Shabbat in the same way as we use it the other week was deeply problematic to our experience of Shabbat. And it may be that will still be the conception of Shabbat in 50 years, but I'm not sure. And so I think that we're engaged in a conversation. That's why I think it's wise of poskim not to draw lines in the sand. The downside of that, as Rabbi Linzer talked about, and we'll talk about more, and we'll get back to it, is if you admit that you're muddling through, so why should anyone listen to you?
So I want to just take a step back and sort of appreciate that. What I did in my earlier comments was to try to sort of talk about the boxes that we would put this idea in about the experience of Shabbat, the use of the idea of Mechalel Shabbat, Chayav Mishum Shvut. How do we get to that with some type of a weighty terminology in a sense of real obligation? What we're talking about now is, okay, what do you fill those boxes with? What is that quality, and who gets to determine that? I agree that obviously that this is a ongoing dialectic between the rabbi and the community, and I would also say the sources. I mean, we could sort of say the rabbi is always based on the sources, but I think that, as Rabbi Klapper pointed out, there's insufficient attention to concepts of Shabbat and to really going back to Torah, to Tanakh, to the Gemara, to really ask how traditionally, not just halachically, has this quality been understood. And I actually want to go back to that in a minute, but I just want to sort of point out in terms of this idea of this evolution. I mean, Rabbi Klapper used the idea of Rav Moshe and the Shabbos clock. I think also, I don't know for people if they've experienced this, but think about something like, is reading the newspaper. Is that like totally vachdik and inappropriate for Shabbat, or that's your owning Shabbat? And I think that in our lives, we have seen, in my life, a complete, like a shift on that. I remember, used to be that was completely usher, was totally vachdik or whatever. Now, like, that's my own Shabbos, right? As I read the newspaper, not say, wait, I got it delivered on Shabbos. It's the Friday newspaper. That's a separate conversation. But anyway, okay, so what?
People read newspapers.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, not just on the web. So anyway, so obviously these things do change, but it's important to then try to, like, identify and concretize that. So let me actually talk about what I sort of see as some of the sources that are relevant, some of the concepts that are relevant, and where I think some of our intuition is around the electricity issue. And I also think that it's important, and this gets to some of the issues about the lights going on as you're passing them and so on. This gets also to the issue of the difference between electricity and electronics. And just to sort of start by a point that I made on Shabbat and here in the show when I announced this, a little story with my son, which I think a lot of us probably experience with our kids. Rabbi Klapper spoke about the idea of Shabbat being a pleasant day. For kids to wean them off of the computer and, the Game Boy and all of this, it's like the biggest tsar can be Shabbat. And I think we all experience this. It's like, how do we, the one day of the week that the kids are, most unhappy and frustrated and don't have, whatever, is Shabbat. Is this what we want the experience of Shabbat to be? However, in my case, I hope in many of yours, after a period of time, maybe as they also grow up and you do your job as educators and as parents, they actually begin to value this experience. And, and there's a real power in the fact that we've able to help them appreciate a day not plugged in. And I think that points to an idea that, this issue about you don't want it to be unpleasant. There's a reality of schwitzing to death and when you need the air conditioner, but there are other aspects about being pleasant and unpleasant that might require us to hold out a religious ideal. And it's not just a question of our immediate reaction and what we can sort of work to grow towards. So let me talk about some of the things I think are important in terms of the quality of Shabbat, both in terms of the sources and our own experience. I think that if I were to stop and ask myself, what to me makes it feel like Shabbat? Number one is you don't go to work. Now that's true. We also have a Sunday, so maybe it's not, Shabbos is unique about that. But certainly the idea that you don't go to work, except rabbis, they primarily work on Shabbat. But okay. But number one is you don't go to work in terms of the experience. Number two is I would say that we don't travel. It's a greater day of community because we sort of, are connecting to people that are very local and that we walk to and come to our house and so on. And we don't sort of, get in the car and travel far afield and so on. Number three is we don't engage in commerce and in business and in buying and selling. Number four, I would say, is the fact that it is more quiet, contemplative, maybe something that creates, again, more time to yourself, reading a book, reading a newspaper, time with your family, maybe a sense of opportunity to actually do some Torah and some learning. To me, these are, I think, the prime characteristics. You notice now one of the things I mentioned was, because we don't do creative labor, okay, which actually speaks to the difference between the experience of Shabbat and the technical halachot of the Lamed Malachot. I actually think that many of these are reflected in early sources, right? So not traveling, Aryeh min komo b'yom HaShabbat, right? Like they were shevet and stayed in their place and so on. Although ironically, and this is interesting to note in terms of a changing idea of what Shabbat is, if you read the Psukim in Tanakh closely, you realize that for some, the whole idea of Shabbat was to travel to a central religious place, right? So Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh was the day you traveled to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Rabbi, to the Navi, as a day of, being with God. You travel to the holy place. Okay, so that also points to an interesting idea of change. But staying, and that's why riding on the horse, as we mentioned before, is a profound idea of this violation. So that's traveling. Not going to work. In the time of Chazal, the Lamed Malachot were very much, and if you read the way they're organized in the Mishnah, about classic professional activities. Baking, scribe, making clothes, building houses. It was not just creative labor, it was what it meant to go to work. Commerce and business is the Yisra of Mekach u'Memkar. You read in Ezra Nehemiah, you read in Yeshayahu, the biggest sense of violation of Shabbat was that everybody was doing business on Shabbat. They were bringing all the wares into the city, and they were buying and the selling and so on. And that's also the sense of this, of the hubbub and the noise and the distracting nature. So I think that all of these are very much in our early sources. I think some of the issues I mentioned before about the shvus, knocking and making noise, and the quiet and contemplative. And to me, I think that that's a lot of the issue about not so much electricity. I think it's a lot of the issue about electronics, right? I think that the electronics sort of takes us away from that interpersonal reaction. It completely absorbs us, pulls us in and also pulls us out into the larger world. It has the exact opposite effect of sort of everything that I was, particularly things like television, computers, cell phones, and so on. That's much more in terms of like electronics. I'm not talking about changing the thermostat on your whatever. So I think my time is running out, but I want to say that I think I'll leave it to you to connect some more of those dots. But I do think also final thing I will mention about, again, electronics and electricity is how highly stimulating it is, right, to all of your senses, and that assault on your senses. And all of that experience, I think, is, at least for us now, I think it's much more about electronics than electricity. And I'll have more to say, but I'll end here.
Thank you. We've heard a lot. I'd like to open the floor to questions from the floor. We have about 5 minutes scheduled for questions from the floor, so if you can make your questions brief, that would be excellent. Sir, at the back.
Yes. I'm intrigued. We all were raised with the idea that the 39 malachot are all based on what was done in deconstruction of the Mishkan. But there's another idea that I wonder if it ever comes up in Pesach. It talks about in the Pesachim Daf Kuf Yitzayin Amud Bey, has Rabbeinu Meir presenting us with a medrash that says, and I'll just get to the point, that the 39 malachot are the way the Egyptians enslaved our ancestors. And we observe this, that's why we're asking, it's Mitzrayim, on that Gemara, by abstaining from those malachot on Shabbat. So malachot really, according to this vision, are all about oppressive activity. It makes things, it's a whole different idea. Does this ever come up in the way, in Pesach? Because I'm not aware of it.
Klapper?
Well,
Maybe I'll say, maybe we want to take a few questions.
I'll take a few questions.
Be a little more efficient. Yeah.
That's fine, Michael.
Yeah, one of my questions is, what do you do when two values are not listed? Even for the clappers. So let's say, now I forgot to Shabbat clock is okay. I forgot to program it. It turned out that bad weather. So I wanted to read my book, but it's dark. Right? So on the one hand, Shabbat supposed to be contemplated, I should turn on the light. On the other hand, then if I should turn on the light, that's it's like, what do you do? And they just become highly individualized. And especially this community base, maybe this community is more religious, and maybe, if you will, can afford a little bit more leeway because their Shabbat, they'll be going to shul. And so maybe they can use electricity because they'll get an experience of Shabbat. But another community, maybe not, because they're not going to go to shul. So, this become all relative, and
Right.
How do you navigate?
Right.
Sir.
I guess I'll pick one. To what degree, when we give across an approach that something that is not forbidden in halacha is permitted, does that kind of work against being able to say to our community, well, we know this isn't really, we can't show you a category, but trust us, it's forbidden. In other words, to a certain degree, haven't we already built up a sense of basically always leading to permissiveness when you can't give a real category? I know you touched on it a little bit by trying to bring up, but again, it's the more you try, the more you say, well, let's call it. It seems somewhat like a charade, and especially within the framework of a lack of halacha category being something that leads to leniency. All of a sudden, we're asking people to basically do the reverse and to allow us to make it forbidden, even though we don't have a real halacha to hang it on.
So those are all great questions. Thank you. So on the first one, I guess I don't think it's been taken into account enough, except in the sense I think that there's the notion that it can't be oppressive, right? It can't be oppressive. I do think we need to think a lot more about what seems to be the growing habit in many modern Orthodox communities, that Shabbat is the day that your non-Jewish live-in workers work really hard. Right, and there's the pasuk which says, and we really need to think about, right, where we tend to think that the problem with Amiral and Nochri is that you're doing malacha through proxy, but really the question, right, if you're talking about what the Shabbat atmosphere is supposed to be, the Shabbat atmosphere, part of it is supposed to be that you are supposed to be a cause of relaxation for the people whom we have responsibility over. So I think that's one way I would really want to see that take into account much more than it is. I think on the other issues, so I think that it would be really great if we could develop a community where we said, you know what I can do is I can give you a standard, and you need to be honest with yourself and decide if this is asur or not. So, for example, I might look at you and say, you know what, you're supposed to do the most Shabbostic thing you can. If the most Shabbostic thing you can do is read a newspaper or play basketball, then that's the most Shabbostic thing you can do. But if you really could spend your time learning, then what you're doing is you're violating Shabbat. It would be awesome if we could build a community where we could give you that kind of responsibility. I think that's what we should be going for. At the same time, right, as you point out, so the process of creating halakha is always a process of navigating conflicting values. Right, that's basically what halakha is. It's a system for making values, right, for hierarchizing values. And the nature of halakha is such that we make rules, and rules will always be counterproductive in specific cases. That's the nature of law. And if we have a relationship in which the community and poskim have a trust relationship, so then you'll say, okay, right, this is what we need, a communal standard, right? We authorize you to create the communal standard, and we trust that you do that. I don't think it works very well when you have an enormous gap between the spiritual intuition of the poskim and the community, and the poskim try and impose their will by force, right? You should have this intuition, but you don't. I think that is not even if I might say the halakha is still binding, I think it's bad policy for poskim to try and engage that way. The better, right? And it's reflective of an educational failure if that's the case.
So maybe I'll start with the last question, which Rabbi Klapper didn't get to, which is the issue about, like, what do we do if we say, okay, this is the halacha, and what would be the impact of it? So look, I think that's exactly the question that poskim are faced with. I think that you can either, if you believe that it's an Isser D'Rabbanan, great, no conflict. But I think a lot of poskim, amongst themselves say, okay, we're going to act as if it's an Isser D'Rabbanan. It should be an Isser D'Rabbanan. We have to adopt that assumption because that gives us the halachic way of of navigating, of knowing that it's usher, and then find opportunities to find that it's mutter when you need to be. So right now, if you ask me, an electricity shiloh, and you don't ask me why, is it mutter to do this or not, I'll say, okay, whatever, in this case, do it with a shiloh. But if you say, Rabbi Linzer, why is it usher? Why can't I just do it? I have a choice. I could either say, well, because it's Asher D'Rabbanan, or we paskin that it's Asher D'Rabbanan, or I could say, and so then I'm choosing. So maybe you feel better about that because I'm making it easier for you. I'm giving you a language that doesn't make it conflictual for you, even if I'm not being completely intellectually honest with myself, and I don't feel I'm being really transparent with you. And I think that is mostly what poskim do, which is, okay, I feel we have work to do. I feel that I don't believe, I believe it's a little bit not trusting of the community, and also more broadly speaking, specifically for us as modern Orthodox Jews, I think we are not good at things I think we have not done enough work at developing a language of religious obligation that is not a technical halachic language. And I think that the Haredi community does that a lot better. You don't have to say that you're not supposed to do this because, which seif in Shulchan Aruch is it, right? This is not how, this is not mental chayder, it's not your shemayim, it's not this, it's not that, this is not what we do. And there's of language that communicates values, it's not sneas, it's not whatever, which is not the question of what actual drabbanan am I being told there. So we need a lot more work in that, number one. And I think that, again, if you said, why is it usher? I'd say it's usher because it's your chayav mishum shvus. And that's what I'm putting out there as a possibility. Not saying, it's not Shabbos day. I think it's also mishum shvus. What do you mean shvus? I think that's what I think. I think there's an isser shvus. So I think I think that's a great opportunity to work to develop that language. I would encourage us to consider that. But I think that you're right, that that's exactly the problem that we're looking at. And just to go back to the Michael's point, I think you point out to the point that, it's not an individual decision. I think Shabbos is a communally lived experience. And that's why, Chal Shabbos Bifer has yet so much about the way the community creates Shabbos, not the individual. So I think that, yes, we have to talk about creating these types of, communal standards and realities. And I think we've actually done a pretty good job by treating electricity as though it's Asher D'Rabbanan. We have successfully created, so a little bit I'm feeling like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like nobody here is saying we should start doing electricity, whatever. When there are needs, we find get teirim. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we've committed, so now everybody does this. The problem is going to be, as Rabbi Klapper says, it's going to become harder and harder and are there going to be ways to use those old structures to deal with those new problems, or are we going to have to start to reconceptualize and to restructure things?
Well, that's a great segue to our next piece, which is to really try to concretize these ideas. So let's bring us back down to earth. Based on what you've been saying about ideal conceptions of Shabbat and the relationship between poskim and the community, how should we treat the kosher switch? People are talking about the kosher switch as a solution for environmental problems, about wasted energy. This is supposed to be a solution for some of those really significant conflicts of values that we're talking about. And from the other side, the side that Rabbi Klapper, you mentioned earlier, about dealing with that Shabbat should not be a day of Inui. It shouldn't be a day where you suffer. It should be the day that you actually look forward to and pursue. What about texting? There are young people who say that if they can't text, they are alienated from their communities. They are not able to interact with their friends. And that means that they just wait for Shabbat to be over so that they can get back to their real lives. So if you could comment on that, that would be wonderful.
I get to go first.
Rabbi Linzer.
All right. So, kosher switch. So, I know somebody said to me, like, this kosher switch, I don't get it. It solves a problem I don't have. Meaning, and I asked this once because we had somebody here talking about the kosher switch. I said more or less the same thing. I said, let me understand this. If there's, the people who are making the kosher switch presumably don't want people turning on and off lights, turning on and off the television, turning on and off whatever, bringing electricity as an active type of a thing into a Shabbat. They want it if there's a tzorech and there's a good reason, then there's a hector way to do it. So I said, look, if there's a tzorech, I'll do it with my elbow. And if there's not a tzorech, then why do I need why do I need the switch? So that's one question. But I say that the same point also applies to like the mechanism. I mean, I'm not going to discuss now. I mean, it's very complicated with lasers and random and this and that about how they make it that you're not directly doing anything. So my response is, shkoyach. So if there was a technical problem to begin with, you've solved the technical problem. I don't believe that there really was a technical problem to begin with. Meaning, again, like I don't think that electricity is a technical issue, except for the case maybe of incandescent lights, right? Then you're maybe making an Aish and so on. But other than the case of incandescent lights, I think it's everything we've been talking about. So what's the point of a technical solution if it wasn't a technical problem to begin with? And somebody came up with the stupidest app that uses all of the battery of your cell phone maximally so that when you now go ahead and text and whatever, you're not using any more energy, so now you can use your smartphone on Shabbat. It's like that's what happens if you act as if we're just dealing with a technical issue. You find technical solutions and you're missing the boat. So I think that is a wonderful example of how we hurt ourselves by only talking in sort of this technical language. Then we don't have any way to respond to those types of solutions. I do think that I will say that I think that I could see using it. Because I focus on the experience of Shabbat, to me, that factors into how I pass in certain cases. I'll tell you a funny situation I had once. Not funny, whatever. A certain shul, I got consulted by, the rabbi of the shul. The toilets that were on that level. I mean, it was a shul that was renting space in the different buildings, so sort of like the automatic dimmer or whatever. So the toilets there, when you flush the handle, you had no idea. It felt completely mechanical, but somehow the mechanism behind the scenes, there was something electric going on. Okay, whereas 3 floors up or down or something, up I think, whatever, the only ex-bathroom, that had a different issue. That issue was the electric eye. So when you stood off of it, then the toilet automatically flushed. So some people were saying, well, you can't actively use the electricity. The electric eye, mimela, it's mitasek, you're just standing up, it happens by itself. So we have to make everybody schlep up 3, stories, people in wheelchairs and disable the whole thing, because that's the better thing. And I said that to me, besides the tircha aspect, I said, complete narishkeit, the thing with the handle, experientially, it feels completely mechanical. Right? So I see that is completely of a different category. I mean, maybe it's mutter lechatchila, certainly mutter, in the case of a tzorech. So that leads a different type to a different type of a psak than if you only think in this mentality. So I would say the same about the kosher switch. Now with the whole issue with the blech and the fire hazard and so on, a few pennies of wasted electricity, this is not the time to be environmentally conscious. Let's work about the rest of the week to be hyper conscious about that, and then we can pay more attention to it on Shabbos as well. But I would say people that are really concerned about real fire hazards, and Shabbos clocks I guess have other problems because they misfunction or whatever, and you turn it on and off and you don't sort of experientially see, if it's a hot plate or whatever, you don't to the same degree experientially sort of feel that sense of like a light going on and something at that level. There I think maybe it's worth thinking about, although even there I would say if you're heating up an element in the hot plate, it could be age, so maybe use your elbow when you use the switch. Okay, that's what I would say about the kosher switch, but I'm very hesitant. The last thing I'll say, because I'm probably over with my time, about the texting. Okay, so I'll say one thing about the texting, which is a point that I haven't yet made about the idea of the experience of Shabbat, which is the Rambam, as opposed to all these other ways which we talk about the quality of the day without connecting to what Isser D'Rabbanan or what Isser D'Oraisa might you be over. The Rambam, when he discusses the idea of Shavuos, this idea we've been talking about, or Shabbaton, he says, because of this idea, Chazal asered things that could lead you to do a malacha on Shabbat, or things that are domel malacha on Shabbat. Experientially, you feel like you're doing a malacha. So I think, for example, that texting, I would much sooner, people ask me, right, if my wife is giving birth or whatever, should she call, should she text, should she do this, right, if I'm going to shul or doctors, I think it's so much better to call than to text. Texting, you're typing out words, you're typing out letters, so I don't think it's even a technical D'Rabbanan of ksiva, because it's all like zeros and ones and it's just being displayed temporarily, whatever, but experientially, it's doma ksiva. And I think lights, even if they're halogen lights, is experientially doma to eish. And therefore, so those are the types of things which I would, have much bigger problems with. And if you had to choose, I would choose those ones that are not doma limlacha.
Thank you. Okay, so let's pick up where Rabbi Linzer left off. I think I agree, but I might use slightly different language. I think when we try and figure out the conception of Shabbat, we're dealing with our contemporary experience, but we're also properly working within the metaphors that we have from the past and the language we have from the past. And so you can't get Shabbat as a biblical phenomenon, right, without recognizing that there's an intimate relationship between Shabbat and the Mishkan. And that's what the 39 malachot embody, right? That the word malacha, right, clusters, right? That the word malacha shows up basically in Maseh Bereshit in the Mishkan. And so we can't, right? So I think texting on Shabbat, right? I think religion is entirely right. Texting on Shabbat is writing, and it's very hard to construct a version in which it's okay to write on Shabbat. It's really, really hard. All the technical versions in the world, excuses in the world, in the end, I don't think, there have always been ways in which you could construct some kind of fancy way out. I don't think anyone really wants to be able to write on Shabbat. Because I think that would just move us too far away from the metaphor. That's not the same question as, do we think that Shabbat is all about having a community with those who are physically present, as opposed to a community, right? Suppose we could, right? Texting is now a very convenient thing, but suppose we get to the point where you just walk into your room and it's naturally, right, you have screens where you can see your friends and talk to them, and that's where you look at your virtual friends, right? So I don't know that we're committed to saying that Shabbat is a physical community. Now maybe that's a version of the prohibition against travel, right? But I think we need to really go back to first principles and construct what the classical conception of Shabbat means in our time. We need, for example, to figure out what Zecher L'Maseh Bereshit means for people who are not literalists about about Sheshit Yemei Bereshit. Right, that's a very hard question. Right, what does it mean, right, to recall creation specifically, if you don't take the first chapter literally. Right, so I think that's one level that we need to address it. I think that I guess more, it has always bothered me that Shabbat is the one day all of a sudden where we stop being environmentally conscious. Right, whether we want to focus Shabbat on environmentalism, that I think that perhaps overreads the second chapter of Bereshit, but that Shabbat, the day in which we are environmentally unconcerned, that strikes me as problematic. I think we also need to recognize that there is going to be a point when it will no longer be possible to make the means prohibited. Right? Because eventually we're going to be able to control all these switches telepathically. Right? It's going to get there, right? We're moving already for some people with disabilities. It's going to be there, and we have to think about other, right? You know, I gave my high school students as a thought experiment once to try and figure out Shabbat and a Jewish calendar on a spaceship that's not in orbit around Earth. Right, well, the reverse for it is the joke is always, what if you're a spaceship that is in orbit around Earth, right? Still on, right? Right. We need to find a way. We need to find a way in which these phenomena are relevant to the immediate experience. I think where Linzer and I perhaps differ is that I think it's a failure of psak if, in the long run, we have no technical halacha to relate to these experiences. And I think that means that those of us who create law have failed. If in the end of the day, all the past law becomes just values, and we haven't created what I think Torah is designed to do, which is to create a political community bound by religious law. And instead, what we are is a political community that pretends to be bound by things that we pretend are law. Right? I don't think that's. So I think that should be our long-term goal: is to recreate. Is to find a way for the malachot to fit. I just don't think that we're ready yet because the world is changing so rapidly that we can't quite do it. But I think that's where we're ending. I think that's the end game, and it's probably going to be a Shabbat that is defined more by consequences and less by means, because the means will always be technical things. Long before the kosher switch, a family commissioned me to do two things for their house. One is they wanted a hot water system for Shabbat, and this is a question I've gotten repeatedly over the years, right? I want to wash my dishes in at least lukewarm water on Shabbat. I want to have, right? And the second was to design a system that would let them turn off lights when they left the room. They were environmentally conscious. So I designed the hot water system, which I really should patent. And then I designed the switch. And I told them I didn't think they should use the switch. I didn't tell them what it was really, because I thought they didn't want their kid being the only one in the neighborhood who grew up turning lights on and off. But it doesn't mean in the long run that it shouldn't be possible to turn LEDs on and off by some mechanism. And I think the Linzer's idea, I had a psak like this recently also, so I don't think that turning the switch with your elbow is a shinoi. I don't pass him that way, that's unusual at all. I think the switch is direct means. But sometimes, I told somebody, I conveyed a psak from a Haredi rabbi to somebody, and the Haredi rabbi had said they could do this, and I thought that was probably the right result. But the Haredi rabbi said they should do it with their elbow. And I said, I don't think that it's a shinoi, but I think it's a heker. I think that, so I think it's good for you. Right, it's good for you to do it that way. So I think that in the interim, we need to come up with things. The only thing I'd say is we have lots of resources. We have, for example, there's a whole Lundish framework that there was Shabbat of Mara, there was Shabbat of Usha. Rabbi Elchanan Adler, who's Rosh Yeshiva at YU, has a fun book in which he details all the developments of Shabbat and halachically at its various stages before Matan Torah. We have you have Shabbat as rationalized in the Asar Dibrot in Yitro, and Shabbat as rationalized in the Asar Dibrot in Vayt Hanan. I think we have enormous resources. I think that as always, we do it in constant dialogue with the past, with a need for legal continuity. It's not as clear to me what the end game is going to be in terms of our relationship to electronics either, because it may, in the end of the day, I'll give one last example, right? So electronics. So I have.
Can I just say one word, and then you'll finish?
Yeah.
Which is that it's presently 8:10 mincha starting downstairs. If people need mincha, then they should go and join that minyan. We'll daven Ma'ariv immediately after this program.
Okay. So I have dear friends it's a critical part of their Oneg Shabbat is classical music is just part of their way of being, and to not have classical music on Shabbat, right, makes Shabbat the least spiritual day of the week. So they put their stereo on a Shabbat clock, and for Shalashus, they have opera. Right. So now this is I've always wondered about how would you handle this halachically, right? If you ask the question, prima facie to most poskim, can I put my stereo on a Shabbat clock? Right. We would say, well, it's Shabbat clock, so can't really say anything technically. And now music, whose music, right? I think those are the kind of things we need to work out. If we live in an environment which is constantly musical, and Shabbat is deprived, we'll either have to turn a bug into a feature, right, or we'll have to find ways to adapt.
Thank you. Right. At this point, we plan for you each have 4 minutes to respond to one another.
Everything that we've heard from the other person.
Rabbi Klapper, I'd just like to hear if you're willing to. You've taken great pains to express that you feel very strongly that sort of what needs to be done. but you've also taken pains to remove yourself from guessing at where exactly that direction ought to be. Are you willing to take a shot at saying kind of where you feel like what are those primary sources that need to be addressed more completely, and what direction do you think Shabbat may actually be going?
So that's I realize I've been running, ducking and hiding more than I usually do in these contexts.
Yes,
You're
I've
texting
noticed
now.
that. I have to admit I am texting. I have to arrange a car for my whatever. It's exactly why I unplugged for Shabbat.
I always love watching rabbis text during the speeches about how their kids are addicted to cell phones.
Exactly.
I've been at many of these like this, where right one rabbi's getting up there at the rabbinic convention, and all the other rabbis are like. I think that, there were two things we said. One is Shabbat is clearly supposed to be different. We have to do that, and that difference is supposed to give you more time to think, and to more time to think as opposed to do, and to think about religious topics specifically. Now, a general critique of me, articulated not least by my wife, is that I tend to be too focused on Talmud Torah as the primary religious experience. Now, on the other hand, religion doesn't seem to have much room for clapping and dancing shalashudis. So I think each of us has our own vision. It's not clear to me that we need to have a single vision. We do need, I think, ideally have a single halacha. So I think I think the overall framework is going to be that we're going to have to find a way to say that in large measure means are irrelevant. Now we'll have to figure out technically, because part of the structure of Shabbat is that there's supposed to be the way of doing it that's forbidden, the way of doing it that is permitted only in B'shas Chak, and the way of doing it that is completely permitted but you really shouldn't know about. Right? Those are the categories that exist. Right? So, for example, right, the way you're not supposed to know that you can pass things hand to hand in Rishut Harabim, right, on Shabbat until your baby until you're stuck with your baby and the Erev is down. Now, some would say, but isn't it really mutter to pass things hand to hand all the time on Shabbat, right? That's really the answer. You're not supposed to know that. You're supposed to know there's a thing called groma, which lets you do things b'shas chak. And the challenge of moving away from means is that I don't want to create a situation where there is no permissible way to accomplish this. So I think that is also not true to the Shabbat, right? The Shabbat in the past. So I think we're gonna what we need to do is to construct the things that we think you shouldn't be able to do to accomplish on Shabbat. And then we need to figure out those three ways of relating to the ways in which they're accomplished. One you just can't do, and one you can do only under necessity, and there always is a technical way out of it, which we think people should have an intuitive sense. You only use that in extremis. That's where I would like to end up. So I think texting is a good example where it's pretty clear we're going to end up not writing. Right? But I don't know that means we're going to end up not communicating. I think it's pretty clear we're going to end up not cooking. Right? And we're not going to use the cheap way out, okay, we're just going to microwave it, and microwave isn't really cooking. I think the technique that Rav Moshe used by microwaves, which is to claim that anything, once microwaves become the normal way of cooking, that is what cooking means. Right? Is the way that the technique that some people have used on the kosher switch, right? That anything that groma means a way which is not the usual way. So I think some technique like that is probably going to be necessary. But beyond that, I'm very happy conceiving of a long-term Shabbat, which is much more at peace with an ongoing technological interaction with our environment.
I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to respond to, but
I'm happy to give you a prompt.
That's fine. So I didn't get, by the way, I do have to apologize for the texting, but I got a little family emergency thing. I'm handling long distance, which is anyway. Look, I think that I wanted to reflect on some of the issues about like walking and the lights dimming and the music, and I'm not against the singing, clapping, and dancing and shalashudis. I think that an interesting thing about this is that is that we have found ways to make some of these things not absolute and to tweak them so that so that they correspond with our understanding of the quality of Shabbat, which isn't always as black and white as some aspects of halacha. So I think we're walking down the streets with the lights, going on. You're not actively turning it on, so you can use halachic language. Are you mitasek, not mitasek? but it's a little hard sometimes because you're aware it's happening and it's a nichole and so on. But I think at some like experiential level, we're not doing it and it's sort of just happening, you know, and so sometimes, you know, the music thing, it's interesting. I'm not going to say that I would matter it, but I think, you know, you have like soft playing music. I mean, I can imagine differences between, do I consider this type of a thing, you know, how would I consider this just in terms of the quality, you know, is it violating the nature of Shabbat? Same with like the sort of a certain type of a singing mirrors as opposed to a different type of a, you know, of a major clapping and dancing. So the point I'm trying to get at is that I think that the question we have to be asking ourselves, the question I wind up asking myself when I get to when I'm dealing with some of these issues, as you've I think heard before, is how much to try to sort of navigate and strike the right balance that we think is necessary, both in terms of the, you know, when there's a tzorech, and in terms of when there's you know, when we sort of think that it won't violate the experience of Shabbat, how much to try to navigate that in terms of technical halachic aspects, and how much in terms of the primary lens that I use, which is how much is this sort of violating or not violating that spirit. So you heard one example of mine in terms of the bathrooms. You know, first of all, I do think an elbow is technically a shinoi, but I also agree with the point that Rabbi Klapper made, which is I tell people to do a shinoi when it's coming to these things in order, because of the experiential aspect as well. So that's a signal to the person, him or herself, that this is, you know, is not a normal thing that you do on Shabbat. And I much prefer like the shinoi technical point because of the experiential aspect of it. You know, and I'm more makil on things that feel mechanical. Like when you get to the key card door on the, you know, everybody has on the hotels, I feel like you usually a little piece of black tape to cover up the diode. So, because that's, I think, the most experiential problem. And, you know, for most of us, I think it feels pretty mechanical. You know, you put it in, you hear a click, you move the door. It's not at the same level. So again, I would sort of emphasize a shinoi, but those are sort of the primary questions, you know, that I sort of find myself asking in terms of those. In terms of like, so I'm not sure if that was responding to a particular question, but that's my immediate response to some of what I'm hearing from Rabbi Klapper. I would say that in terms of where we're going, I don't think that, I mean, you know, I think it would be very harmful to think about, you know, I love the sort of theological and theoretical thought experiment that you put out there. Like, what would happen if we thought about all these things and where might it go? But I think in terms of where we are as a halachic, observant, traditional community, that's a very unhealthy way to go, because that introduces like the potential of radical change. And, you know, to the degree, obviously, that things have changed, it's much sort of incremental and there's an osmosis. And I think a lot of the changes that are necessary are going to come because they're necessary, not because we did a theoretical rethinking. So if it's impossible to walk down the street, that's going to force us to either find a technical solution or to rethink things in a particular way. Like what I was getting at was rethinking electronics versus electricity. I think that that's a way, you know, when it's not doma limlacha, that we might find ourselves going. So if you ask me, that's just the more, what's going to happen more is I think what I described and not what you described. And I think it's also the more appropriate way is to let us sort of muddle through and figure it out as we go along, because or else we're just going to introduce too much radical change.
Klapper, you want?
Yeah. So let's
maybe 2
I
minutes.
think some of these are, you know, are really fun and contra. Like, you know, I don't know what it means for something to feel mechanical as opposed to electronic, because that just depends on how it's normally done. Right? And if you understand that that's right, that's going on that way, it doesn't feel mechanical, it feels electric. So I'm not sure what that, honestly, I'm not sure what that means. The deeper, right, the deeper issue, I think, is that Linzer is certainly correct that radical change, right, radical discontinuity is almost always bad for law. And so when one engages in broad thought experiments, right, you can't engage in the broad thought experiments and then, right, you can't make the French Revolution mistake of imposing this rationalist constitution on the population. And I think that poskim have to show great deference to the intuitions and experience of the lay community on these issues. But at the same time, I think we have to realize that there's a reinforcing loop, right? Because if we poskin exactly in accordance with the intuition of the community, then there's no way that we can begin to adjust, and we really need to adjust because the world, right? We're constantly saying things that at some point people look at it and say that's ridiculous. All right, hey, because everyone, for example, knows that all toilets below ground level have electronic assist. Right?
I didn't know that.
Okay, I think everyone's right. So I've let the cat out of the bag, right?
Okay.
But it's not possible, right? It's got to go uphill. Right? You can't make things go uphill, right? Without applying some kind of force. And right, and I think there are lots and lots of other areas where every time we try and claim something is usher, people who have any technological know-how will say, "But how is that different?" To some extent, right? That's the microphone hearing aid problem, right? Which we're trying to find ways. But I think we need to be prepared to handle that. And so part of that is that we need to start having brainstorming sessions, recognizing, as you do, right? As you do when you have, I don't know, flat tax conventions, and among sane Republicans, right? It's probably not going to happen next year. But it's useful to have some kind of long-term vision. I do think it's going to have to be negotiated in the over a very, very long time. Change happens gradually. In large measure, it means seeing right? So we have to recognize that we're going to walk down the street. All these things are going to change. We're on cameras all the time. There are spy cameras overhead. There are cameras. There are security cameras, and we want to be on the security cameras. There are lights being dimmed on and off. So we have to see this coming. And we need to be able, as a religious, we need to be able to build with the community the articulation of so the only place we differ is I think we need to be able to articulate in a formal legal language that people will find credible. Right? Part of it is and part of the purpose of developing the informal language is to prepare people for the development of a formal language, because in the long run, I think it's not just because people don't listen. I think it's because the nature of our religion is that we want our primary experiences to be formally halachic. And so, right, so again, I think it's a failure if, in the end of the day, Shabbat is all about values, not about law. So we have to be working towards a day when we can credibly say, you know what, that really is usher, and that which is not really usher, you shouldn't do.
I just want to make a very brief response to that, which is my problem with that is, besides that, I think, as I said, as a community, we have failed because we only talk halacha. But besides that, my response to that is, if we were still in a position where we could legislate, then we could say, yes, then we have to legislate and create that law. But since we have to find it in pre-existing law, then what your approach, the challenge of your approach, which is the challenge now of people who know the halachic literature on electricity, is that they're not convinced. So I think that I agree with you. Ideally, if we believe in a legal system, we would have a legal language, but what we would need is the power to legislate. And because we don't have the power to legislate, it's not always going to be possible to do what you're trying to do in a convincing way.
So I will note in my last 30 seconds that in the very beginning,
this is fun. At least we're finally disagreeing about something.
Well, I'm glad I'm here to keep time.
Yes, okay.
Linzer asked me at the very beginning, right, whether how I defended Rabbi Blaich's claim that we can extend deoraitas in ways we can't extend rabbanans. The reason for that is exactly what Moshe Feinstein's thing, that things that Chazal never thought of can't be asur rabbanan because their legislation is limited by what they could conceive of. But the Torah is not limited, right? Because God can conceive of everything. So I think that, right, and what you may say by convincing, right? So again, it's not convincing that milking a cow is threshing. Right? It's only convincing within the particular language of it, right, that grows up. So we need to build a language, right, in which certain kinds of electronics are as convincing as milking a cow being threshing. I don't think it's a very high standard.
Okay. Excuse me. We have 5 minutes to take questions. So yes, Dov.
I have a question about change. I think one of the underlying problems is that the pace of change is so rapid that within one generation, as you say, we can't even understand what are the needs going to be. And I wonder if you agree, is there a similar kind of period in halachic history in which rapid change occurred to a degree that necessitated some kind of revolutionary step or a more extreme than usual development of the halachic process? And could that be a model for thinking about this situation?
Well, an immediate one comes to. I'm sorry. We're taking a few questions.
Take a few questions. Any other questions? Yes, David.
You think that some of the concepts like that we're talking about, the walking down the street and the lights, so Sikresha Lo Nikolai, that some of the aspects of what it means to be Lo Nikolai, that there's some flexibility there, or or is there too much history in all the existing terms that you need to appeal to some of the things that Rabbi Linzer was suggesting in terms of shvus that haven't had as much historical buildup.
One more? Yes, please.
What did happen to the concept of not engaging in creative activity versus
Right.
physical activity? I kind of lost it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. No, it's a great question. So I didn't mean to discount it, but because it's the Dorisa. To respond to the first question, I'd say the first thing that comes to my mind is not a technological point, but it's the advent of modernity and the Haskalah, when 90% of Klal Yisrael stopped being Shomer Shabbos and we had to figure out, what are we going to do? We're going to say that everybody, that 90% of Klal Yisrael is Machal Shabbos b'fer Hesed, and therefore puzzle and excluded and outside the community. And the response some people said that and still say that, but the response was, no, actually, we're going to take this category that used to be really, really tiny called Tinok Shenishba, for somebody that was like taken captive and grew up as a non-Jew, that Rambam sort of extended maybe to Karaites in certain circumstances. And we're now going to say that 90% of Klal Yisrael is Tinok Shenishba. So that I think is like and then everybody sort of got on the band, not everybody, people who wanted to get on that bandwagon got on that bandwagon. And maybe that's, an example of what Rabbi Klapper said. You make, if there's enough of a need and you make a strong enough case for something, maybe we can start just taking for granted that everybody is a Tinok Shenishba. So that's at least one example that comes to mind. In terms of the question about can we start finding ways to change some of those halachic categories, some of that's really hard. How could you say it's lo nichale? You like the more light. There's a very surprising Rabbi Yosef who says that if you forgot to take out the light in your refrigerator, you open up the door, it's lo nichale, because since you really could find it without the light, you really would rather not have to spend the 3 cents on the electricity, so it's lo nichale that the light goes on.
Well, that would certainly apply to the walking down the street.
That's not your bill. Why? Because it ultimately factors into your taxes or something?
No, but it's not the on that you really care. It's the fact that you would much prefer that it just stay on. The fact.
But right now it's off. So in the big picture, I don't know. So all right. The point is, I don't think that's as you've heard, at least my approach is that that's not the direction I would go for a general approach in these matters. And also, I think that there would be too high of a cost in terms of how some of those redefinitions would then filter into the other areas where it really are technical concerns. The last point, I really appreciate you mentioning it, because the point I was trying to say was point out the sort of irony of the fact of how our experience of Shabbat, and if you would ask us to characterize what the Shabbat experience is so radically different, or not maybe radical somewhat, but anyway, so distinct from the halachic aspects of Shabbat, because the biblical halachic aspects, maybe not the rabbinic, but the biblical ones are about this creative activity. And for us, I think most of us, that's not so big at the experiential level, but that's what Shabbos violation is biblically. And I'll just end with one story about this. I was once at Limud. People here know right about Limud, New York, whatever. And they said, everybody has a different idea of, Shabbat, because it's a whole diverse range of people. What we ask is that in the public space, create a Shabbos experience that works for everybody. In the public space, there's no electronics and no music. Okay, so great. So it was Friday night. It was after davening, and there I was in the public space reading my book. The table right next to me is a family playing Scrabble, and there they are, keeping score as they're playing Scrabble. And I'm looking at it, and I'm saying, oh my God, didn't they listen to the announcement? It's the public space. And I said, yeah, they did listen to the announcement, because they're not playing music, and they're not using electronics. And the reality was that it didn't violate the experience of Shabbat, at least in terms of the shared public experience, the way that music and electronics might have. And some people could debate the music aspect, but certainly that electronics would have. Yes.
Okay, so I'll agree with your answer to the question on the technicalities. On the change issue, so I think in general, right, the social change caused both technology and the Enlightenment in the last several hundred years is not, really the previous traumas are the destruction of the temple and in exile, and you want to put us and it's very hard to reconstruct historically how Chazal reacted to that. So I'm very leery about saying we should react the way they did. I think we're feeling our way. We don't really have such precedent. I think on the issue of creativity, pardon?
Which is probably exactly.
Which may be what they did also. Right? Although they had Bayit Rishon, right? They had the destruction of Bayit Rishon as a precedent. Somewhat more recently, not. Yeah, I don't know. I think there isn't really precedent for radical change, right? That's a kind of odd notion. Right, the precedent for radical change. I think the issue of creativity is really important, but again, I think we should be very careful about trying to figure out what we mean by creativity. Let's say, for example, one vision of Shabbat is that Shabbat is a day in which we are freed from our material bodies and we are angelic. Shabbat is a day in
I
which
thought that was Yom Kippur.
no Shabbat also right that's right right Shabbat is the right Shabbat is a day in which in which we don't have responsibility, right? All our physical needs are prepared in advance, right? Shabbat is a day in which we can really be right. We can express our true creativity, which is Torah. Right. I think there are all sorts of ways in which to view Shabbat as Shabbat is the day in which we are like God, right, and so we can be truly creative, right, in language, which is the way God created things, right, by using language. So I think we should be very leery of one-to-one correspondences of that sort. That we have a very, very sophisticated tradition, and to some degree, it's been reduced to one note for the purposes of for the purposes of rhetoric. And I think in our community, largely it's Heschel and Hirsch who have done this brilliantly. But I don't know that that's the only way that we can end up. So my take is, with the agreeing the caveat by Linzer that we're not in any way going for radical halachic change, although we should acknowledge that to some degree, if we look down, we'll discover, as Rabbi Linzer points out, that radical halachic change has happened. Right, all the halacha we're trying not to change has grown up, like mushrooms, right, spontaneously in the past 50 years. Right, so I think we have to be very cautious about retrojecting the halacha as we have it. And I think we need to do a lot more really serious thinking and to find a way, which is a general challenge of our community, to think really hard about first principles without sacrificing our fidelity to law, right, to law as it is, and finding a way for those two together, right? So one of the symptoms of that crisis is that people think only law has religious meaning, right? Another symptom is the fact that there are many areas of law where we don't have law. Right? And we need to try and solve both of those. That would be my overall message.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Klapper. Thank you, Rabbi Linzer. Thank you to Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and to the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, and to the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. We'll daven Ma'ariv in the next 10 minutes.
Rabbi Lopatin, would you like to say any final words at the end of the series?
Well, we look forward to seeing. I see actually some college, high school students, and we have our summer learning in August. So if you're still interested, we have 1 or 2 slots left. So